I do a lot of public opinion research and data analysis research on the American electorate and on Latino voters, as well as non-Latinos. And I also study campaign outreach effects and whether campaign persuasion, campaign mobilization efforts make any difference. When I am called upon to do a talk like this, what I try to do, if I can, is rely on data that is very publicly available, so that you can access it too, right? And that the other side could access it, if they have arguments to make. I don't like, going into, the back room and sitting behind my computer and cooking up something, if I can avoid it at least. I like relying on very public sources of information. It seems like a very fair way to deploy evidence. So what I have, for example, bearing on the question of immigration as a priority is a very recent Pew study, and the citation is on the very bottom. You can go to this. It's on their website, the Pew Center, not the Hispanic Center in this case. As you know, Pew has a family of research operations, and this one happens to be the Pew Center on People and the Press. And I think as Margaret has indicated, this year, and this is just from a couple of weeks ago, there isn't very much evidence of high interest in immigration. And of course, this is important to this particular group because the argument on the immigration expansion side usually goes something like this. The public cares about immigration, so we need to make it a legislative priority. Swing voters care a great deal about immigration, so we need to make it a legislative priority. And Latino voters care a lot about immigration. Therefore, we need to make it a legislative priority. That's very much what you hear, on the expansionist side of the debate. That because these particular groups care a lot about immigration, Republicans and Democrats up on the Hill should be focusing on it. This is, of course, a concern because in recent rounds of immigration reform, certainly over the last 30 years or so, when immigration legislation does come up on the Hill, it tends to move in an expansionist direction. Invariably, it seems the restrictionist forces are intimidated or in some cases are just simply outnumbered. And so, the restrictionist-oriented pieces of legislation or amendments are defeated. And as in 1990, it starts out in a restrictionist direction but winds up expanding immigration. Okay, so, there's understandable concern about bringing legislation to the Hill because of this recent history. Well, when you take a look at tables like this, they suggest that immigration, at least for voters in 2012, as of a couple of weeks ago, is not a very high priority. It ranks 12th, in fact, way down at the bottom. In 2008, it was slightly higher, but still pretty low. So, when immigration expansion advocates say, people care about immigration, one thing you should ask is, well, compared to what? Compared to what? I mean, we can have opinions about lots of things. We can care about lots of things. But of course, what really matters is, where those things rank in terms of intensity, how much we care about them. And as you can see here, immigration is pretty low, and from 2008 to 2012, it dropped even lower. In fact, when you look at a number of Pew surveys between 2007 and 2012, and then connect them with a trend line, you can see that drop. I took a number of Pew surveys and just charted them in terms of who is saying it's important and who's saying it's not too important or not at all important. And the trends are pretty obvious. And of course, this is exactly what we would expect, right? Because there's lots of research suggesting that when economic times are particularly bad, when the country drops into recession or depression, people become greatly concerned about open and expansionist immigration policies. In terms of priorities by presidential preference, again, same September 12th through 16th survey from a couple of weeks ago on the Pew website show that, and I call your attention particularly to this third column up here, swing voters. I know this is small, so I'll make sure that Leah has the slides, so if you want to get them and look at them yourself later, that's fine. As I said, this is available on the Pew site as well. But it's interesting that swing voters don't consider immigration to be nearly as high a priority as some of these other issues, like, for example, education that was mentioned, jobs, obviously. The economy is a no-brainer. And so, 39% is not very impressive at all, when you compare it to the other numbers in that third columns under swing voters. As you can see, it's slightly higher priority actually for the Romney voters than for the Obama voters, which I think is kind of interesting. It's about 11 points more important for the Romney voters than the Obama voters. Of course, this points to an ambiguity associated with all questions that ask about the nation's issue priorities, or the well-known question that pops up on many surveys, most important problem. What is the most important problem? When people say immigration, of course, they may well have in mind that they want border control, right? And not more generous or expansionist policy at all. Right? Or they might want workplace enforcement, or what is it that they're thinking, okay, when they're asked about their most important problem. So be careful about that too, right? When you run across it, you see that immigration is regarded as a high priority among this group or that group. Well, in what sense do we mean that immigration is a high priority? Because I think that for these 47% of Romney voters, probably what they have in mind is very different than what the Obama voters have in mind when they say it should be a priority. Okay, the Romney voters are probably at least somewhat familiar with their candidate's position on the issue. So it's just another caveat. Still, across the board, regardless of what individual survey respondents might be thinking, when they consider the immigration issue, is a pretty low priority. It's sinking rock bottom. And by the way, this question or questions similar to it are asked in many surveys, and sometimes they don't have 12 options, sometimes they have 6, sometimes they have 7, and immigration's one of them. Pretty low, just as Margaret indicated, and particularly nowadays. Okay. But you have to go back to 07. It wasn't even that, or 08, and it wasn't even that high then. Okay, so if you go back a couple of slides, it wasn't even very impressive when we weren't in recession. As far as the argument that swing voters care about it, I'll just echo some things that Margaret said. I think she covered it very adequately. Bear in mind that there aren't very many swing voters out there, okay? And, again, don't take my word for it. I didn't cook these numbers up. This comes from a recent Pew survey. Okay, and it's very nice graphic that maybe we've got 22%. A large share of that 22% lean in one direction or the other. They tell the survey researcher, the person on the telephone, that they're undecided or that they're independent, but they have a preference. They're just not quite as open about revealing it as the other survey respondents are. And, I also think that, Margaret makes a very shrewd point when she asks, now how many of these people, this 7% pure undecided, or even the 22% there that are swing voters, she asks, well, how many of those are in swing states? Okay, and that number gets even smaller, right? Some of these folks that are swing voters are in places that are electorally safe as far as the Electoral College goes. They're lost for one candidate or the other. We know that going in several months in advance, right? So the Californians, the Texans, the New Yorkers, they all need to be discounted from this number, okay? So, we're talking a very, very small, share of the electorate, and here are some recent facts, a recent study by a pretty neutral organization to bolster the argument. I also comment on, the stability of party preference. Again, one argument that's often made on the expansionist side is that there is all of this swing in the electorate, okay, and that if we change positions on issues, the electorate will shift accordingly, and I think that there's pretty good reason to doubt that. Because we have probably 50 years of studies in the social sciences that suggest that party preference is something that's pretty entrenched, pretty stable, and that again, people don't depart from it, once it's formed. Usually it's formed in young adulthood. People just become more entrenched as they age through the life cycle. It takes a major event or earthquake to dislodge them, from their party preference. And this is, the pollster.com party preference data from lots of polls that they monitor. Again, pollster.com is an operation run by the Huffington Post. Okay, so it leans, on toward the liberal side of the aisle, and you can see that, the percentage Democrat, Republican, Independent. It ranges within a very small, margin, just very small, 2 or 3% at most, and quite a bit of that is, just random fluctuation because, of course, there is error, in these surveys. So, that's something to keep in mind too. That it's not easy to convert people, okay, from one party to the other once their party identification is formed. That's not an easy thing. Imagine a continuum, okay, and on one end would be very whimsical opinions like, what I want for dinner tonight or my favorite flavor of ice cream, okay? And on the other continuum are beliefs or attitudes that we have that are rock solid and enduring, things like religious preference, for example, okay? Or ethnicity, that doesn't change much, and our views of our ethnicity don't change very much. Well, party ID is much closer to this end of the spectrum than this end, okay? It's not whimsical like, gee, I like chocolate, or I think I'll have some vanilla tonight for dessert, all right? Now, maybe it isn't quite as stable as religion either, but I'm telling you, on the continuum, most of our research has shown that it leans much closer to this end of the continuum than this side. Okay, so, when campaign consultants, all right, setting aside the immigration issue for a moment, when campaign consultants come out in the newspaper or come to your organization and say that, they have all of this power to manipulate public opinion, no. Obviously, they have an incentive to say that, right? Okay, because that's how they make their living, all right? But the fact is that they have very little power over public opinion. And most of our tests, and this is why this is related to my work on campaign outreach, most of our tests on campaign outreach come back null. Consultants hate me. They hate me, okay? But they come back null. In other words, there's no impact, all right? Their outreach, their direct mail, let's try the pink one. Okay, sorry, most of those tests come back completely null. All right, so getting back to immigration, the idea that, a party can attract a large crowd of voters, by shifting its policy positions, no, that's not going to happen. And that's why I think, as Margaret pointed out, time and time again, you see a very stable and predictable share of Latinos going Republican, pretty much no matter what Republican candidates say. Okay, they can get between 25 and 35% of the vote across the various states. Okay, pretty much no matter what candidates say on immigration policy, and I think that's because it's party that is really running the show and queuing their vote. and not these, whimsical views, on policies of various sorts. And by the way, immigration policy isn't unique on this. Okay, there are lots of other policies that are largely impervious to change. Okay, so this is something that Margaret talked about. That no question, Latinos are a growing share of voters. Again, the eligible population. Far outstrips the actual number of voters. Okay, she made that point. I'm not going to dwell on it. I think it is worthwhile, for Republicans, to think about, maybe how they get more than 30%. What I'm doubting is that immigration policy is the instrument to that end. Okay. Thanks for the time note there. Margaret indicated this. This is from a 2010 Hispanic survey, so I'm just backing up, her point here. Except in Florida, where you have about 30% of Latinos who are registered Republicans, 38% Democratic, 28% Independent. This is what the breakdown looks like in terms of party identification. It's 2 to 1, and just like the vote. Okay, so. But I think what was interesting, and I have a series of papers on the Center for Immigration Studies website that you might check out that bolster some of these points. But even in 2010, which was a very strong Republican year, Republican support among Latinos was pretty much what it always was. Okay, it was a little higher in Florida, but lower in New York, of course, typical in California and Arizona. So, even in a year where we might expect a surge to the Republican side in 2010, we saw about the same margins as we always do. Again, I think there is some diversity of views among the Latino population. It tends to follow, once again, the distribution of party support. Latinos who are Republicans are less enthusiastic about expansionist immigration policy or the DREAM Act, than Latinos who are Democrats. So, those are very good points. I completely agree with, what Margaret emphasized on that. How do Latinos, how would the Republicans make more Latino Republicans than they have now? Well, there's some indications. I think you have to look at the Latinos that they have now, right? And the Latinos that they have now have a particular profile. They tend to be a little higher income. They tend to be suburban or even rural. And that's important because to learn about a party's politics, you need to be in a location where that party has rank-and-file partisans and where that party regularly fields candidates. Right? So, downtown San Antonio is not the place, right? You settle in places, like urban Texas, urban California, there aren't any Republican candidates, and there aren't very many Republican voters either, right? Where you're going to pick up Republican politics are in places where you have Republicans. That's sort of a no-brainer, okay? And so, as the population of Hispanics moves out, of inner city areas, their geographic mobility is often upward mobility, not always, but often it is, then you'll see a drift to more Republican politics. For one thing, Republicans are an option in those places, whereas in a lot of our inner city areas, no, there aren't any Republicans even running. Right? There's no Republican organization. There are very few Republican voters. Religious involvement with evangelicals seems to matter. Seems to matter a lot. That you have quite a few more Republican Hispanics or Latinos where you have evangelical converts. Okay, so as Latinos get more involved, in evangelical communities, they seem to be socialized in a more Republican direction. Also, I think ancestry makes a difference. And of course, ancestry matters a lot to them. There are quite a few Latinos at the Pew surveys and the Hispanic Center surveys that Margaret indicated show this, that pan-ethnic identity is, the title Hispanic or Latino is not something that all Latinos cling to. They're very proud of their national origins, okay, their ancestry. And so you have some ancestry-based differences. Of course, the Cubans are the best known, okay, but also you tend to find South Americans, Central Americans, to be less overwhelmingly Democratic than Mexicans. So, any other points here? I think the point about Latino policy views differing, there is some heterogeneity there, is a good point. You know, I found a 2010 NBC Telemundo immigration survey that indicated support, this is national support, for the Arizona illegal immigration law. And this is just Latinos, so all Latinos are in the first column, and only Latinos who are registered voters are in the last column. I think what's interesting about this survey is, sure, you know, there's a majority that are either somewhat opposed or strongly opposed, but there's a substantial plurality that are either somewhat supportive or strongly supportive. And, you know, we knew from surveys done in the state of Arizona that, you know, 25%, 30% of Latinos in that state were themselves firmly in favor of the law, and were going to vote in favor of Governor Brewer on that basis. So, you know, there is some heterogeneity within the population that's notable. I think it's probably true that most of these folks who are supportive of the law are themselves Republicans, though, like I said. So just summary, yeah, I'm predicting that Mitt Romney can count on a pretty stable share of the Latino vote in November. I suspect, I don't know if he's going to win the election. Doesn't look good right now, but regardless, I think probably around 30%. And that will be perfectly consistent with past patterns of support. And it's also a sign, as I said, that, you know, immigration is not the top priority issue, or especially immigration expansion is not the highest priority issue for those Latino voters. So, you know, I think that the point that Margaret made, and I would emphasize, and this is in my CIS paper, Latino voters are very much the same as everybody else. Okay, you know, I mean, I happen to live with one. Okay, so I know a little bit about it from firsthand. Okay, they're not that different. You know, they're not from Mars. Okay, you know, it's that they have the same interests that other people do. You know, in terms of jobs, the economy, education, these are things that concern them. And, you know, immigration, well, kind of, sort of, sometimes, you know, but it's not the burning issue that, you know, the advocates on the other side want to construct it to be. So I guess I'll stop there, and, you know, maybe in Q&A we can get to some of these other points.